All right.
In progress. Okay. So today, I guess kind of tonight, we're not in the night yet. We're still in the throes of sunlight. Shout out summer hours. But we are honored to have Gary Phillips, who is a local to you come in our bookstore, like people
Yeah.
know some of the other authors that we're friends with. So we're really excited to have you for a virtual talk. One Shot Harry is your new crime novel, and it's been selling fantastically in store. We have this other sign, the signed copies that we have left from.
That's all right. Let that cat come in.
Really likes it. He likes a good LA crime noir.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
We're so honored to have you in here because for you, so you've published novels, you published comics, novellas, short stories, and co-edited slash edited several anthologies,
Yes.
including Anthony winning Obama Inheritance, 15 stories on conspiracy noir.
Right.
And even cooler than that, almost after 30 years after your debut publication went out, Violent Spring, which I'll share a link to as well, you were named Essential Crime Novel of LA. And here you are again saying, oh, I'm even more essential. I'm writing a second one. And the second one is set in the backdrop of Los Angeles in the 1960s. For folks who don't know, we'll get a little more into the talk there, but it's a riveting historical crime novel based around a African-American forensic photographer seeking justice for his friend. So without further ado, we're going to be talking about One Shot Harry tonight. I'll be sharing the link. Get a copy online or stop by Chevalier's in person.
There you go. You should introduce yourself, so
Oh, yeah, Chevalier's is Los Angeles' oldest independent bookstore. So we know a little bit about LA, but not about LA crime so much, hopefully, except for when our door got smashed in. But yeah, so if I will have a few questions for you after you do your talk and then the reading.
Okay. Well, I'll just somebody dialed in. All right, so I guess to encapsulate the book, it is set in '63 in LA. It's a sort of pivotal period, I guess, in the history of the city, and in particular, the plot revolves around, which this was a true incident. Martin Luther King came back to LA. I mean, he'd been to LA several times, but he came back to LA in April of '63. Now, this is 4 months before the historic March on Washington. But mainly he came back to help raise some money toward that and raise the profile of that. And he spoke at Wrigley Field, and a lot of people probably don't know. I mean, obviously people know about the Wrigley Field, the more famous incarnation in Chicago, but there in fact was a Wrigley Field here in Los Angeles, in South Central at 41st and Avalon. And he came to speak at that, what was billed as the Freedom Rally. And my character, Harry Ingram, is a crime photographer / process server who's a Korean War vet, and he becomes involved. Well, one, he's just going to cover the event, but there are events that lead up to that rally. Specifically, a old army buddy of his from the Korean War, who'd lived in LA before, comes back to town, hints at something he's involved in. He dies under mysterious circumstances, and this sets my character in motion. And Harry, though, of course, wonders, as hopefully maybe the reader will wonder to some extent, is Harry just making this up? Maybe his friend really did die in a car wreck, and it was nothing more than that, and maybe Harry's trying to make more of this than there is to sort of give himself something to do to push himself forward. But nonetheless, he plunges in, and things are revealed. Things revolve around that. And I should say, and I've mentioned this before in some other talks and interviews, my Harry Ingram is based on, or not based on, I guess that's probably a bit far-fetched, but he is inspired by two actual figures. One was a man named Harry Adams, and Harry Adams actually was a photographer here in Los Angeles who worked for the Black Press as a freelancer. He was also a part-time barber, and Harry Adams, whose archive of material, some of which can be found out at Cal State University, Northridge, he wasn't really a crime photographer. He really more or less, but he took a lot of shots of, I don't know, various things, parades and gatherings. But when King came to town, Malcolm X came to LA several times, he certainly would cover them, and he would go to their events, to their talks, and he would take those shots. And so that Harry was in my mind, as well as then there's a famous fellow who was nicknamed Ouija. His real name was Arthur Fellig, and he was in New York, so he's on the other coast. And he was in New York, I suppose, the heyday was sort of the late 30s through the early 50s. And he was a sort of peripatetic individual, the small man with glasses, and he always have a cigar hanging out of the side of his mouth. And he would have the police scanner going, and he would go out and cover this or that incident, this or that violent scene, or at least the post of violence captured in his camera, so that there was a mob rub out. So there's a guy laying in the street, so he'd shoot that. Or there's some guy lying in the vestibule with a knife sticking out of his head because his old lady finally got tired of him. He'd shoot that. So he took a lot of these shots, and several of a lot of his photos have been collected in more than one book. And I believe there's a fairly recent biography out about Ouija. And he also inspired a late 50s, early 60s TV show called Man with a Camera with Charles Bronson. And then some years later, I guess this is in the early 90s, there was a film called The Public Eye with Joe Pesci, and he essentially was playing Ouija, Arthur Fellig. So both these guys are in my head, and the King event is in my head. And so this then combined to make the book that I wrote, and it kind of setting everything in motion. I suppose then, I'll talk a little bit more, and then we'll read a little bit, and hopefully we'll have a few questions, one way or the other. I'm not quite sure. I've been thinking about this. Now, it's somewhat interesting that I kind of stumbled into using 1963 as the setting for this story. One, of course, the King incident, but I didn't really necessarily need the King incident. I could have just used Harry in any other interval in time. But I thought it turned out to be fortuitous in that, as I said, the city at that point is kind of in this, not quite a turning point, but that things are happening. In 2 more years, there's going to be the Watts riot, the Watts uprising in '65, so that's going to happen. But and also the city is coming out of, although it's still kind of there at the edges, what was called the Red Scare. And so folks who are too young to know this, certainly during the '50s, all over the country, but in Los Angeles as well. People who were suspected of being leftists or members of Communist Party or the Socialist Party or whatever, you had to sign loyalty oaths as a teacher, or as loyalty oath if you worked in any public capacity. Of course, there was the famous remnants of the blacklist in terms of actors and directors and writers being forced out of their professions. Some of them using what became known as fronts. In other words, they would get a job to write a script, but they would have to write it through one of their buddies, pretending that the buddy was writing the script, but they were actually writing the script. They sometimes would split the fees or what have you, but as a way to keep working. And some of these folks then eventually just went overseas to work. And so all that period, and then we're coming out of that period. We're also in a period where the chief of police, and this is another accurate factoid in the book, William Parker was actively recruiting white officers from the Jim Crow South to come to be LAPD officers. You had housing covenants, restrictive housing covenants that were still in the books. And so all these are sort of factors happening at the same time. Of course, then you have the push from the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, of course, is jumping off in the South. But of course, there's a lot of push to have those same rights for folks here in sunny California. And not for nothing, you have a sort of what's the word? I guess a kind of growing discontent certainly among those who had been veterans of both World War II as well as veterans of the Korean War, with the Vietnam War, by the way, just kind of right there on the horizon. But who had, fought for equal rights and freedom overseas and expected those same rights to be had here at home. So anyway, all that's sort of a clash and a kind of subtext to the events of the book that take us into this world. But hopefully, I've made pains not to present. It sounds more of a soapbox than I hope that the book is. I think the book reads pretty well because it's a mystery story, right? It's a crime fiction story, and it's about following this character, Harry Ingram, as he tries to solve the murder, what he perceives to be the murder of his friend Ben Kinslow. And along the way, as I said, you sort of get a glimpse of what's happening here in the city. You get a glimpse of the time period, and not for nothing. I will add this. Not for nothing. There's a couple of scenes that happen in West Adams, and West Adams in that time period was a very mixed race part of the city, where more or less I guess you might consider to be the sort of the black middle class, doctors, lawyers, dentists, and such, had homes. And it's also the same time that the Santa Monica Freeway is coming through, right? So there's been eminent domain, has been pushing out, but this has brought some of the neighbors together to work together to try to stop the freeway, or at least have the freeway detour from where it eventually bifurcates part of the area, which it does today. I mentioned that because I was recently reading a piece about there's one particular group, I think it's called the CIM group, who is now essentially flipping the West Adams area, or at least that strip of Adams Boulevard from, I guess, like Crenshaw to Fairfax, where Adams turns and ends. And so it is interesting to see this this period of gentrification that's happening now in West Adams as it forces out, as it buys out some of what's remaining of the older inhabitants, some of the local store owners and what have you, as now you make way for quote unquote progress. So anyway, all that to say is that, not to say that I was any prescient or anything like that, but it is kind of interesting to see that some of the same issues, a little bit of those issues that are talked about in the book in the West Adams area all those years ago in the 60s now sort of are presented again. Here we are in 2022. I should also mention, and I'll mention a little couple of things about Harry, and then I'll do a little reading, and then maybe we'll get into a little bit of a Q&A, or I can discuss a little things further. Not for nothing, Harry's lady in his life, or comes into his life in the book, is Anita Clare, and Anita is the daughter of activists, left-wing activists. Her mother's white, her father's black, and they themselves had gone through a rough period of time in the 50s, and this affected her and her sister, at least, coming of age. Not that it was a trauma so much, but just it was a way of their interpretation, their understanding of how the world works. And so she has a certain hard edge to her, but I really enjoyed having her as a character in the book. She's a mathematician by training, but she's getting more in the political sphere. When we meet her in the book, she's working for the Tom Bradley campaign, and this part is also accurate. Bradley, who would later become mayor of Los Angeles, first black mayor of Los Angeles, at that point is running. He'd been on the police force for a number of years, and now at this point he's running for the city council, and he'll win that race. So in this book, in One Shot Harry, she's working on his campaign, and now I'm working on the second One Shot Harry book, and in that book, which is set in 65, a couple of years later, he's on the city council. So there's that. And also because I mentioned that Harry is a Korean War vet, today we would call it PTSD, but in those days, I believe it was called battle fatigue or even shell shock. I guess shell shock was the term they used in World War II, but which is to say that Harry is suffering from the ghosts and the baggage that he carries with him from the war. There's a couple of incidents that I talk about in the book that have affected Harry, and certainly one of the things that led him to essentially put down the rifle and pick up the camera. So those are measures, those are things that are weighing on Harry's mind. Not to the point that he is incommunicado or he's not functioning. I mean, he functions quite well, but these are things that that are sort of in his head and weigh on him. But he is a man of a certain. He's a man in '63, so there's a certain kind of not macho thing, but it certainly wasn't the thing in '63 for a man to go seek therapy, which you should, but it wasn't one of those things that you would do then. But he does, in fact, have several conversations threaded through the book with his buddy, Arthur Yarborough. Arthur is also a veteran of the Korean War, but he lost his sight in the war when a landmine blew up. He stepped on a landmine and blew up and took his sight. And he runs a small grocery store on the ground floor of where below the apartment where Harry lives. But they're friends. They didn't serve together. They served together in the sense that they were both in the war together, but they weren't in the same unit. But they had since met post the war, and because they talk about that, and there's one particular incident, and actually it's going to be part of this little bit what I'm going to read, where the effects of the war are weighing on them, and just part of the makeup, part of the thing that makes them who they are and drives them forward. Just as with Anita Claire coming through the period of the Red Scare and her folks being haunted and hunted by the FBI and the authorities. So she herself suffers from a kind of PTSD as well. Not to say they're not particularly damaged people, but these are the things that have affected them. I'm going to read this little passage, and then I'm going to explain a little something after I read it. But I'm going to read it first, and then we shall see. All right. Ingram felt elated, having achieved a minor victory in his confrontation with the cop. He took a bus back to his apartment and made a double-decker sandwich for his late lunch, early dinner. He then went back out, this time with a specific destination in mind. He stepped inside the Lucky Clover Tavern on Broadway. The bar was originally built here in a location which was a terminus for the yellow car trolley. Unlike the red car, which served the inner urban area, the yellow car operated inside the city with downtown the center. There were a few trolleys still in operation, but the transportation department had announced that those two would be mothballed by year's end. The name of the watering hole was straightforward, but as the freeways came to dominate and define Southern California, patrons who'd been coming to the bar for years routinely called it the cloverleaf, as in the crisscrossing patterns of the region's many elevated freeways. Sam Cooke's Twisting the Night Away was playing on the jukebox as Ingram sat at a stool at the bar. People laughed and conversed. Ingram liked the place. The atmosphere was inviting, as a neighborhood joint should be. Haven't seen you in a while, Harry, the barman, Clyde Hampton said. He was a barrel-chested man with salt and pepper hair. Hampton wiped down the bar with a flourish. You been on the wagon? Not hardly. Give me a beer. No, make that a rum and coke. Been that kind of day? Damn right. Cuba Libre coming up. Soon the barman returned with his drink, and Ingram drank slowly, realizing there was tension in his shoulders, a residue of his encounter with the cop today. There were black cops on the force, but why the hell was it the white ones he always seemed to encounter? Surely sitting here at the bar with luck in its name, some of that had to rub off on him, didn't it? He sniffed, having more of his rum and coke. relaxing some. Hey, GI, you lonely tonight? Ingram's head shot up from the napkin he was looking at on the bar. Who said that? He glared at men and women, couples, and those sitting by themselves. Little Eva was singing Locomotion on the juke. But that woman's voice. He wheeled back around on his stool and chalked it up to his nerves. The welcome alcohol warmed his insides. He had more, already considering another round. I know you're cold out there. Ingram bolted off the stool, nearly knocking it over. Hey, man, the customer next to him blared. God damn, that was Soul City Sioux, Ingram muttered. He wiped his wet tongue over his dry lips as he went in search of the voice that used to broadcast to tired soldiers on those bitter cold winter nights by the Natkong River. He looked hard at various female faces, some of them staring back at the possessed man. But this was a black bar. Occasionally there might be a white or Asian person in here, but it wasn't unheard of for city department clerks or typists to come in here with co-workers. But there were no white faces in here tonight, and, as he told Ben Kinslow, Ingram had seen a photo of the woman who called herself Soul City Sioux. She wasn't here at all. Though, what if those pics he'd seen in the magazine had been mere propaganda from the enemy? What if it was a trick by the Red Chinese, the backers of North Korea? They might have set the whole thing up, duping the press as part of their plan. Hadn't they perfected what was called brainwashing, using psychological methods to break the will, making a person do things they wouldn't normally do under their own steam? It wasn't so crazy to think the commies might have a reporter or two in their midst. White bread-eating white Americans who'd been given the whammy, and even they didn't know they were under orders from Peking. Wasn't that the plot of that movie he and his buddy Strummer had seen last year, The Manchurian Candidate? POWs reconditioned to carry out deep-seated orders planted in their minds. There had been a scene where one of the GIs was ordered to strangle another captive. Ingram sat back down at a different position at the bar. He was aware eyes were on him, including Hampton's. Be cool, he advised himself. Don't blow your top. If he next started seeing that child from the Chorwan village walking up to him, they'd carry him off to the loony bin for sure. Everything okay, Harry? Hampton was there in front of him. Yeah, just winding down is all. He shook his glass, knocking the ice around. Give me another one, would you? Coming up. On alert, Ingram was poised to hear Sue speak again, but there were no other words from her. Must be a screw loose in his addled brain. Was he under too much strain? Cobbling together a living, chasing photos of people doing bad things to each other with the occasional process server job sprinkled in. Always unwelcome when he showed up, bringing unwanted news. Maybe he ought to sell shoes or refrigerators. A job bringing smiles to faces. What did that guy Dietz said? If Harry hadn't happened along today, it might have gone way different with the cop. Ingram nodded. That was something to hold on to. After finishing his second drink, ignoring the nervous glances of the other patrons, he paid his tab and left the Lucky Clover. On his way home, he hunched his sport coat around his shoulders against the cool of the evening. Soul City Sioux didn't call to him from an alleyway or from a passing car. The ghost of a hungry and scared 9-year-old didn't materialize in front of him either. Even the cops left him alone. A weariness from more than the day's activities overcame him by the time he got inside his apartment. He sat in his favorite chair and fell asleep. So just to kind of give a little context, Soul City Sioux was an actual personality from the Korean War. Just like there was Tokyo Rose and Axis Sally in World War II, there was this woman with a lovely voice who would be broadcast over the PA system, from enemy lines to the Americans hunkered down the foxholes, or over radio from North Korea. And of course, her job was to undercut morale of the troops. Now, this didn't really undercut anybody's morale, but they just enjoyed listening to her, and she would play, records from back home and this and that. And as it turned out, oddly enough, Soul City Sioux was not Korean. She was a white woman from Arkansas. So I suppose one day somebody will have to do the movie about her to explain all that, because I believe there's a movie coming up about Axis Sally, who I believe was also not German. I believe she was British. Anyway, so all that to say is that this kind of propaganda was used then, and in fact, there was a couple of others that were similar in Vietnam as well. And for those who might remember, there used to be a show called MASH, which was kind of this great little comedy drama show about this mobile army surgical unit in a hospital in Korea, the Korean War. And there's a couple of episodes where we hear Soul City Sioux being broadcast to the troops. So anyway, so that's a kind of another indication of the baggage that Harry is carrying with him as he tries to move forward to try to solve his buddy's death.
Thank you, Gary, for that wonderful reading. And it actually, when you first started, I was like, this is perfect, because you started talking about the trolley system and the bar that was there. I was thinking, like, you've already brushed on a little bit of the research that you did for this book, which is a lot. You were mentioning the archives with the photos. I guess my question will be then, what's the coolest thing that you spotted when you were looking at these archives, like, that maybe like surprised you that you didn't expect to see?
That's a great question. When you it's as we all people know, right? When you will also be, because of the internet, you go down these various rabbit holes, right? And and it takes you this warren and that warren. And also because I've got a great set of, not encyclopedias, but I have a great set of sort of books that are about the history of LA and particularly this time period. And so invariably, I'm looking for one thing. So the internet is great for facts and figures, right? But you're right. But then I'll go look in one of the books and I'm looking up, whatever I'm looking up, something from very specific time period, a very specific week in a year, and then you'll read something that you hadn't chanced on before, and then this will take you somewhere else. And so just the idea that, when I was looking up, how did Wrigley Field get built in LA, and what the AAA Angels played there, and there was a struggle then, I guess, at some point, when the Dodgers came west and they moved people out of Chavez Ravine to build Dodger Stadium, but there was also a kind of move that maybe they would build Dodger Stadium where Wrigley Field was, and so it's just always very interesting to see these little interplays, these little things that have helped them, create this landscape, to create this city. So it's never any one thing that I find. All of it I find fascinating. I guess that's really the answer. I find all of it fascinating, and there's just these little gems that you just sort of read about or cover. For instance, I mentioned in passing, really. I mentioned there was a store called Dolphins of Hollywood. And this actual, by the way, it was nowhere near Hollywood, but it was started by a guy named John Dolphin, of all names, and it was at Vernon and Central, so it's in South Central, and it had, in those days, it was a pretty good sized place, and it had, of course, it had vinyl, which was the thing then, and 45s, and it had listening booths. And because it played a lot of popular Black music, you had white kids coming down to Dolphins to hang out, right? To listen to music. And you had this kind of interesting mix of Black and white kids, teenagers, late 50s, early 60s. And Chief Parker, the same Chief Parker who recruited officers from the Jim Crow South, was not having it. So he would routinely send the cops down to Dolphins to break up the party, to send the white kids back to their part of town. And so just reading about that, just thinking about that as part of the city's growth, and this kind of nugget in time, and these little lost histories, right? These little lost histories that you won't see, in a movie, you won't see it on a TV show, but they exist and they help to, form this city. So I think that's what I find fascinating.
It's interesting that you mentioned TV shows, because my second question was going to be whether you could see this book becoming on screen for something, because I know that you've written for TV before. Yeah. So you were a story editor on Snowfall with
Yes.
FX. So I'm wondering if you could see that kind of overlapping and it going to the script.
Well, of course. I mean, I would love nothing more than to do a one-shot Harry miniseries where you follow Harry around, and it's it's this time period, and all all these sort of layers and things that have kind of suffused in the book, and be able to kind of pull back a little bit more on and have a little bit more fun with, and maybe go back into into some of the backgrounds of some of his buddies who we initially meet in the beginning of the book, where they're just sitting around talking smack and drinking beer and playing dominoes and listening to a Red Fox record. So yeah, the idea that you could have that a visual kind of excursion with Harry would be just a lovely thing.
Yeah. I guess I'll ask another one. What was your favorite? Who was your favorite character to write? So you mentioned a few of them, but like anybody that kind of like stuck out to you that was different from your past novels that you just had a lot of fun with.
That's a great question, right? I think I plot out these books, right? And I do an outline, and then as I'm writing, as I'm writing, I put the characters in, but then when I put them on paper, and I've written a little bit about their background, or I've thought a little bit about who they are, and then you try to figure out, well, how would they answer a certain thing in a certain situation? Obviously to make them distinct one from the other. So I guess I get a thrill out of thinking about who these. So as an example, I guess really to answer your question, I find out something about them as I'm writing them. And so, for instance, one of Harry's buddies is a Japanese American, Josh Nakano. And Nakano is a World War II veteran, and he served in the 442nd, which was an actual unit of all Japanese Americans. The nickname was the Go for Broke Brigade, and they suffered a high rate of casualties, but they also suffered a high rate of victory in the war, and they were in the European theater. So they fought. They did not fight against the Japanese, but they did fight against the Axis in the terms of the Nazis. And there was a scene, but here's this guy who, and I mentioned that he'd been a radio operator, but yet here he is, this man who has seen death, and now he's a funeral director of all things, right? And I didn't really poke at that in this book, but now I'm writing the second book, so I'm thinking more about how is it that he became a funeral director? And I mentioned that he has a son, but the son is in Hawaii. I mean, he's not grown. The son is young, he's 9 or 10, and he's not living with the father and the mother, obviously, or he's with the mother in Hawaii. And I just mentioned this in passing, right? There's just a little aside, but those little asides, I guess, stay with me. And so then I think about them, and then I want to then circle back to them. And I guess that's the answer. The answer is these things I plant these things, and I'm not even quite clear why I plant them, but I'm interested in them. I'm interested in finding out then kind of these answers to some of these questions I pose for myself. So I think in that way. So I guess in that way, no one character. Obviously Harry's the main character, so I'm fascinated by Harry. But all the characters fascinating because I'm always trying to figure out something about their backstory, and something about, it's always about what brought any one of us to the point that we meet them, right? And what's their motivation? What are they thinking about? What do they want in life? And you don't have all that real estate to explore all of that, but you can get some glimpse of that. And so if I can get a little taste of that, I think that's all to the good.
Yeah, I feel like just with your talk, we can tell that the side characters, like, yes, they're not the main, but they don't feel side. They don't feel like just cardboard cutouts. Like every one of them is bringing some different aspect to themselves, but also Los Angeles during that time, and kind of really building a picture of what Los Angeles was like during the 1960s and like what people were experiencing during that time.
Well, sure. Thank you. I hope so. Yeah.
I think our audience is a little shy, so I'll say, is there what is like one more, if there's something that you can leave them with, of like, don't forget this about the book if you haven't read the book yet, like this is why you should. I mean, it's an amazing and original novel.
Oh, thank you. I think the one thing I'd like to leave folks with is, we've talked a lot about, sort of the history and how it plays a role in the book, but I want people to understand that, it's an entertainment, it's a mystery novel. I think you'll be satisfied in that regard. I do think, though, that, along the way, you'll learn a little something about Harry. Harry is going to learn a little something about himself. And as things are revealed, as secrets are laid bare, you also get a little glimpse, a little taste of the history of LA, and I think, as we talked about, like these interconnections that were there then and are still playing out now.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Gary. For the folks who are here tonight, if you know someone who wasn't able to make it, I've recorded the whole thing, so it's going to be up on our YouTube channel. It's been a fantastic talk, a fantastic reading. And if you don't have a signed copy, you want a signed copy, you can come into Chevalier's. But if you are not in Los Angeles, I guess, because sometimes people in our virtual chats aren't in Los Angeles, you can use that link that I sent to get a copy shipped to you as well.
Yeah, excellent.
We'd love to see your face in store to get a copy of One Shot Harry if you can. So thank you so much, Gary. This has been great.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a good night.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.